In 1945, when American forces arrived in Pingfang, in the northeast of China, they found the ruins of a facility that had been hastily destroyed. The buildings were burnt. The records were mostly ash. And the prisoners, there were no prisoners left. But the Americans who investigated that site didn't arrest anyone. They didn't prosecute anyone. They didn't tell the world what had happened there. Instead, they made a deal. They traded justice for data. They took the results of the experiments conducted inside that facility, experiments performed on thousands of living human beings, and they classified it, buried it, and the men who ran the program walked free. For the next 40 years, most of the world had never heard the name Unit 731. Today, you are going to hear it, and you are not going to forget it. To understand what Unit 731 was, you have to understand what Japan was doing in 1932. The Imperial Japanese Army had invaded Manchuria, a vast region of northeastern China, and established a puppet state they called Manchukuo. It was occupied territory, with a civilian population living under military control and very little oversight from the outside world. It was here, in this human blind spot, that a Japanese army surgeon named Shiro Ishii began building his empire. Ishii was brilliant, ambitious, and completely without scruple. He had spent the late 1920s studying biological warfare programs in Europe and the United States, and he came back to Japan convinced of one thing: that germ warfare was the future of military conflict, and that Japan needed to develop it before its enemies did. The Japanese military agreed. They gave him funding, they gave him men, and they gave him something that no researcher with a conscience could ever have asked for: unlimited human test subjects. They called the prisoners Maruta. It means logs. It was larger than the Pentagon, and completely hidden from the world. In 1936, Ishii broke ground on what would become one of the most secretive and heavily fortified military facilities ever constructed. Located in Pingfang, near the city of Harbin, the complex eventually covered over 6 square kilometers. It housed more than 3,000 Japanese personnel at its peak. It had its own airfield, its own power plant, its own rail connection, and its own prison. From the outside, the locals were told it was a lumber mill, which is why, if you think about it, calling the prisoners logs takes on a meaning so deliberately cruel it almost defies comprehension. The entire operation was one continuous, sustained lie, and everyone inside the lie knew exactly what it was. The prison block, known internally as the row block, could hold up to 400 prisoners at a time. The cells were small, cold, and kept at specific temperatures to suit ongoing experiments. Prisoners wore no shoes to prevent escape. They were fed well enough to keep their bodies scientifically useful, and they were told nothing about what was going to happen to them. Records show that at least one of the victims was a child under the age of 10. The prisoners came from across occupied Asia. The majority were Chinese civilians, farmers, factory workers, resistance fighters, and people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were Korean, Mongolian, Russian, and in the later years of the war, captured Soviet soldiers. American and British prisoners of war are also believed to have been held at the facility, though the full extent of this has been obscured by the post-war classification of records. They arrived by train, handcuffed, blindfolded, often having no idea what country they were in. Once inside Pingfang, they were photographed, given a prisoner number, weighed, and assigned to a research program. Their names were no longer used. In the internal documentation that has since been recovered, they appear only as numbers. The records that survived show that the ages of the prisoners ranged from elderly men and women to adolescents. Records indicate that at least one of the confirmed victims was a child under the age of 10. A child listed in a scientific log, given a number, assigned to an experiment. This is not speculation. This is in the documentation. Ishii's team infected people with diseases that had no cure, and then watched them die. To measure how long it took, what happened inside Unit 731's research blocks was organized into different divisions, each one focused on a specific category of biological or chemical warfare development. Understanding this organization is important because it reveals something about how the atrocities were committed, not in chaos, not in rage, but in calm, methodical, bureaucratic order. This was science. This was paperwork. This was men in lab coats with clipboards, recording data. The Biological Warfare Division worked with the most dangerous pathogens known to medicine at the time. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and hemorrhagic fever. The purpose was not to cure these diseases. The purpose was to observe their progression in controlled human subjects, to determine incubation periods, lethality rates, and the most effective delivery mechanisms for weaponizing them. Some prisoners were infected through contaminated food or water. Others were injected directly. The results were recorded, the bodies were disposed of, and new subjects were brought in. Frostbite research was conducted throughout the brutal Manchurian winters. Prisoners were taken outside and their limbs were submerged in ice water or exposed to sub-zero temperatures until frostbite set in, at which point researchers would thaw the tissue by various methods, record the results, and repeat the process. They called this procedure a vivisection. They performed it while the subjects were still conscious. The pressure chamber experiments were designed to discover at what point the human body could no longer survive altitude decompression. Information with direct military applications for aircraft and high-altitude operations. Prisoners were placed inside sealed chambers, and the air pressure was rapidly altered. Testimony from Japanese researchers who worked at the facility describes subjects convulsing, bleeding from their eyes and ears, and in some cases, their intestines prolapsing from their abdomens due to the pressure differential. The researchers took measurements. They adjusted the variables. They ran the experiment again. Perhaps the most disturbing category of experimentation, from a purely clinical standpoint, was what the internal Unit 731 records referred to as anatomical research. To understand the internal effects of the pathogens and weapons being tested, researchers needed to examine organs in real time, not post-mortem, where decomposition would affect the results, but during the active progression of infection or injury. They called this procedure a vivisection. They performed it while the subjects were still conscious, and in many documented cases, without anesthesia, because anesthesia was believed to interfere with the physiological readings they were trying to obtain. There were also weapon testing programs. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields and grenades, flamethrowers, and chemical agents were deployed at measured distances to assess lethality and injury patterns. These tests were methodically logged. Some prisoners survived multiple tests and were returned to their cells to be used again. The documentation that exists on these programs is not rumor. It is not allegation. It is, in many cases, the researchers' own words, given in testimony, written in journals, and in one extraordinary case, deposited directly with the U.S. Army in 1945 in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Unit 731 did not just experiment inside its walls. It took its weapons into the open air and used them on cities. Unit 731 was not merely a research facility. It was, from its very inception, a weapons development program, and those weapons were used. Between 1940 and 1942, Ishii's unit conducted at least 11 documented biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities and towns, deploying plague-infected fleas dropped from aircraft, cholera and typhoid introduced into water supplies, and anthrax released into food sources. The most heavily documented of these attacks targeted the cities of Changde, Ningbo, and Suzhou. In Ningbo in 1940, Japanese aircraft flew over the city and released ceramic containers filled with plague-infected fleas. Within days, an outbreak of bubonic plague had begun in the city's most densely populated districts. The death toll from this single attack was recorded in Chinese public health records at over 100 confirmed plague deaths, in a city where plague had no natural presence. The outbreak continued for weeks. Investigators who arrived after the war found the ceramic canisters. They found the fleas. They found the plague bacteria matching the strains developed at Pingfang. These were not experiments. These were attacks on civilian populations using biological weapons, the use of which was already prohibited under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Japan had signed. The death toll from all of Unit 731's field operations against civilian populations is estimated, conservatively, at over 200,000 people. Some historians put the figure significantly higher. Ishii's last order before surrendering: kill every prisoner. Leave no witnesses. In August 1945, When Japan surrendered and the Soviet Union entered the war in the Pacific, Ishii received word that Soviet forces were advancing on Manchuria. If this video stayed with you, if it changed something about how you see history, or power, or the cost of silence, then that is exactly what this channel is built to do. Every week, we go into the stories that were buried, the truths that were classified, and the histories that were traded away for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if you know someone who would want to know this story, share it. Because the best thing you can do for the people in that museum in Harbin, the people with numbers instead of names, is to make sure the world does not forget that they existed.